Blood smells like copper and old pennies, but the politics of a hospital carry the thin, cloying scent of cheap lavender lotion layered over pure exhaustion. They thought I was nothing more than a float nurse, a temporary ghost who appeared only to cover lunch breaks and handle the worst of the bedpans. Then the Blackhawks rattled the windows and heavily armed men came storming in, screaming for Dusty. Fluorescent lights do not buzz. They hum, a low, abrasive frequency that works its way behind your eyes somewhere around the 10th hour of a 12-hour shift. I was standing in Bay 4 of Mercy General's emergency department, holding a plastic basin of vomit, trying to focus on that steady hum so I would not have to listen to Beverly. Beverly was the charge nurse. She wore scrubs the color of bruised plums and clogs that struck the linoleum like a heavy gavel. "You're floating today, Morgan," she said without looking up from her tablet. Her tone carried the precise pitch reserved for nursing students and broken equipment. "I know they had you up in neuro step-down yesterday, but we had a call-out. Don't touch any central lines. Just do vitals, clean up, and keep the board green. Leave the heavy lifting to my core staff. Understood?" "Understood," I answered. My voice stayed flat, deliberately flat. I emptied the basin into the hopper, hit the flush valve, and let the smell of institutional bleach burn the back of my throat. It masked the vomit, but only barely. I didn't care about the insult. You do not take a job as a float nurse if you still have an ego. You take it because you want to be invisible. You belong to no unit. You attend no staff meetings. You never get invited to the Secret Santas, and no one ever asks about your weekend. You simply appear, plug whatever hole is letting the ship take on water, and clock out. That was exactly what I wanted. For years, I had made decisions that decided who would breathe and who would bleed out in the dirt. Now all I wanted was to empty bedpans and be told I was not qualified to flush an IV. I walked out of the sluice room, drying my hands on a scratchy paper towel. The ER was locked in its usual mid-morning chaos. The air was thick with rubbing alcohol, stale sweat, and the faint, sweet decay of diabetic ketoacidosis drifting from Bay 2. Alarms chimed in a disjointed, erratic rhythm. To the civilian staff, it was a war zone. To me, it was simply a waiting room. Dr. Chen, a second-year resident who still looked as though his mother should be packing his lunches, hovered over a patient in Bay 6. An 80-year-old man with a fractured pelvis from a fall. Dr. Chen was frantic, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to secure a peripheral line in an arm that looked like translucent parchment. The monitor kept dinging. Blood pressure was dropping fast. I watched from the nurse's station. Beverly was on the phone arguing with a lab tech about a lost sample. Two other core nurses huddled around a computer, complaining about the cafeteria menu. Dr. Chen missed the vein. A small bloom of dark blood pooled beneath the old man's skin. The resident cursed under his breath and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He was losing the window. The patient's skin had taken on that waxy pallor, the color of old soap. I felt a familiar, unwelcome twitch in my fingers. Muscle memory. The urge to shove him aside, grab an intraosseous drill, and drive a line straight into bone. Fast, brutal, effective. Instead, I walked over, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the sticky floor. I did not say a word. I simply reached into the cart, took a pediatric butterfly needle, and gently tapped the back of the patient's hand. Dr. Chen looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I've got this," he snapped. "I don't need a float." "You're blowing his veins, doctor," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. I didn't look at him. I looked at the old man's hand, feeling the subtle, sluggish roll of a vein between the metacarpals. "Hold his wrist, keep it taut." Dr. Chen hesitated, pride warring with panic. Panic won. He held the wrist. I slid the needle in. A tiny, perfect flash of crimson filled the chamber. I taped it down fast, connected the saline flush, and pushed. Smooth, no resistance. "Fluids are wide open," I said, stepping back into the shadows before Dr. Chen could even process what had happened. "You might want to order a cross-match. His abdomen is rigid. Pelvis fractures hide a lot of blood." I did not wait for thanks. I already knew I would not receive any. I walked to the break room. The coffee in the carafe looked like used motor oil and tasted worse. I poured a cup anyway and let the heat burn the roof of my mouth. I sat in the corner chair, the vinyl cracking beneath my weight, and closed my eyes. I was so tired. It was not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was a bone-deep exhaustion, the residue of a life I had boxed up and buried. My left knee throbbed with a dull ache where shrapnel had permanently rearranged the cartilage in a province I never wanted to think about again. I rubbed my eyes. Just a float nurse. I repeated it like a mantra. You are just a float nurse. You don't matter. You're safe in the shallow end. The break room door swung open. Beverly stood there, hands on her hips, face pinched into a scowl. Morgan, break's over, she snapped. Bay 3 needs a cleanup, and when you're done, stock the isolation carts. The real nurses are busy. I took one last sip of the terrible coffee. On it. The vibration did not begin in the air. It began in my teeth. I was elbow deep in the isolation cart counting N95 masks when I paused. The plastic wrapper crinkled in my grip. I swallowed hard as a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Civilian medevac helicopters, the shiny red and white ones that land on hospital roofs, carry a high, frantic whine. They chop the air lightly. This was not a civilian bird. This was a heavy, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. It resonated through the concrete pillars, vibrating the loose ceiling tiles. It was the sound of an MH-60M Blackhawk. The sound of a fully loaded armored machine displacing a massive amount of air. And from the syncopated resonance, there was not just one, there were two, maybe three. I dropped the masks. In the ER, the civilian staff remained oblivious. Monitors continued beeping. Beverly was still yelling at someone over the intercom. They could not feel it yet, but I could. My pulse kicked up, a traitorous spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. My hands, perfectly steady when dealing with a dying octogenarian, began to tremble. I shoved them into my scrub pockets and backed against the wall. No, not here, not my problem. Then the red phone at the charge desk rang. It never rings. It is a direct line to county dispatch for mass casualty events. Beverly stared at it for a full 3 seconds before picking it up. Mercy ER. What? Her voice lost its sharp edge and dissolved into reedy panic. Wait, you can't land here. We're a level 3. We don't have trauma surgeons on standby for... She stopped. Whoever was on the other end was not asking permission. The heavy thudding grew deafening. The double doors at the ambulance bay rattled violently on their hinges. Dust and dry leaves blew past the frosted glass. Code yellow, Beverly shrieked, dropping the phone. Everyone, code yellow. Clear the trauma bays. We have incoming. They're bypassing admin. They're landing in the lot. The ER erupted into chaotic, disorganized motion. Nurses crashed into one another, pulling crash carts. Dr. Chen looked as though he might vomit. Even Dr. Harlan, the attending who usually moved at the speed of molasses, was sprinting down the hall. Morgan, Beverly yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. Get out of the way. Stand against the wall. Do not touch anything in the trauma bay. I didn't argue. I pressed my back to the cool plaster, heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to run. I wanted to walk out the back door, climb into my beat-up Honda, and drive until the road simply ended. The smell of aviation fuel seeped through the ventilation system, mingling with bleach and sickness. It smelled like Afghanistan. It smelled like failure. The ambulance bay doors did not merely open, they were kicked open. 4 men surged into the pristine, brightly lit ER. They looked like an alien species among the pastel scrubs and white coats. They wore filthy, sweat-stained tactical gear, plate carriers strapped tight over combat shirts. Real sand, not the dirt from the hospital flower beds, clung to their boots. They moved with terrifying, synchronized aggression, carrying a Stokes litter. Clear the fucking way, the lead operator roared. His voice was a gravel pit. He carried no weapon, yet his mere presence was a threat. He shoved a gurney aside with one hand, sending it crashing into the wall. Bay 1, Dr. Harlan shouted, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice cracked. The operators ignored him. They hoisted the litter onto the nearest empty bed in the open floor, disregarding the sterile trauma bays entirely. I stayed pinned to the wall, trying to control my breathing. I could see the man on the litter. His uniform was shredded. His left leg ended abruptly below the knee. A makeshift tourniquet was twisted so tightly into his thigh that it cut into the muscle. But that was not what was killing him. It was his chest. A massive gaping wound just below the collarbone bubbled with pink froth. Tension pneumothorax. His trachea was deviating to the right. He had minutes, maybe less. We need to get him to surgery. Dr. Harlan rushed forward with Dr. Chen. We need blood. O negative, massive transfusion protocol. Let me see that chest wound. The lead operator, a massive man with a ragged beard and a patch on his shoulder I recognized with a sickening jolt, stepped directly into Dr. Harlan's path and placed a heavy gloved hand on the doctor's chest. Back off, the operator snarled. I am the attending physician, Dr. Harlan protested, though he shrank back from the sheer physical mass of the man. He's dying. He needs a chest tube. He needs... "You're a civilian who sets broken arms," the operator said, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of the ER staff. The room fell dead silent except for the ragged, wet breathing of the dying man on the bed. The operator's gaze swept over the huddle of nurses. He looked past Beverly. He looked past the crash carts. "Where is she?" he demanded. Beverly swallowed hard and stepped forward nervously. "Sir, I am the charge nurse. If you tell us what unit you're with, I can contact the VA or the military liaison." "Shut up," the man snapped. He turned in a slow circle. "I know she's in this hospital. Dispatch tracked her license." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. No, I held my breath and tried to blend into the plaster behind me. I wore generic blue scrubs. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun. I was a ghost. The operator drew a deep breath, the smell of copper and death radiating off him. He looked straight into the crowd of cowering medical professionals and roared, "Where is Dusty?" The name hung in the air like a phantom, a relic from a life I thought I had burned to the ground. No one moved. No one knew who Dusty was. To them I was Morgan, the float nurse, the girl who cleaned up vomit. The man on the bed seized in a brutal full-body arch. The bubbling in his chest worsened. Another operator, holding pressure on the stump of the man's leg, looked up with wild, desperate eyes. "Knox, he's crashing! He's losing his airway!" Knox, the giant with the beard, looked genuinely panicked, raw fear cracking through his tactical discipline. "I need Whiskey 6, he screamed at the room, voice breaking. "I need Dust-Off Actual, now!" I closed my eyes. The hum of the fluorescent lights faded, replaced by the ghost of rotor blades, the memory of screaming engines, and the smell of hot sand. I did not want to do this. I was so tired. If I stepped forward, the ghost would die. Morgan, the float nurse, would cease to exist. The man on the bed let out a horrific, rattling gasp. I opened my eyes and looked at my hands. They had stopped shaking. I pushed off the wall. My rubber soles made no sound this time. I walked past Beverly, who stared at the men in wide-eyed terror. I walked past Dr. Chen, frozen in place. I walked straight up to the giant named Knox. He looked down at me, eyes wide, recognizing the posture even if he did not yet recognize the face. "Move," I said. My voice was no longer flat. It was sharp, cold, a scalpel. Knox stepped back instantly, deferring to the tone. I looked down at the dying man. I did not see a patient. I saw a puzzle that was rapidly coming apart. "He needs a needle decompression right fucking now," I said. My hands were already moving before my brain fully registered the command. I did not look at the doctors. I looked at Beverly. "Beverly," I barked, the command echoing off the linoleum. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, a scalpel, and a chest tube tray. Skip the betadine. Just give it to me." Beverly blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. You're not authorized to..." I did not yell. I didn't have to. I simply looked at her, letting years of combat trauma stare back into her terrified civilian eyes. "Bring me the tray, Beverly," I whispered, "or he dies on my floor and I break your fingers." Beverly ran. She practically threw the plastic tray onto the edge of the bed, hyperventilating, eyes darting between the armed men and the blood pooling on the linoleum. I ignored her. I ignored Dr. Harlan sputtering about liability. My hands tore open the sterile packaging of the 14-gauge angiocath. It was no longer sterile, not in this room, not with dust and sweat falling off the operators, but it did not matter. Infection kills in days. Tension pneumothorax kills in minutes. I found the second intercostal space on the right side of the soldier's chest, right along the mid-clavicular line. His skin was clammy and cold, stretched tight like a drum over his ribs. "Hold him down," I ordered. Knox and another operator flanked the bed, pressing their weight onto the dying man's shoulders and uninjured leg. I did not hesitate. I drove the thick needle straight down into the chest cavity. There was a distinct, sickening pop as the needle pierced the pleura. Immediately, a violent hiss of trapped air escaped the catheter, followed by a spray of pink aerated blood that hit the front of my blue scrubs. The smell of iron hit my nostrils, thick and heavy. The man on the bed, his name tape read Tanner, sucked in a massive, ragged breath. The terrifying blue tint around his lips began to recede, replaced by a dull, mottled gray. His trachea, which had been pushed to the left side of his throat by the pressure in his chest, slowly shifted back toward center. "O2 sats are coming up," Dr. Chen whispered from the corner. He stared at the monitor, sounding completely bewildered. "Heart rate is stabilizing." "It's a temporary fix," I said, voice hoarse. The initial adrenaline was leveling into a cold, hyper-focused tunnel vision. "He needs a chest tube. Now. Where's that scalpel?" Beverly pointed a shaking finger at the tray. I grabbed the blade. I had no lidocaine. I had no time to prep the site. I found the fifth intercostal space, just anterior to the mid-axillary line. "Tanner, I'm so sorry," I muttered. I made the incision. Blood welled up instantly, dark and fast. I dropped the scalpel, grabbed a pair of curved Kelly forceps, and shoved them brutally into the incision, spreading muscle and tissue. It is an ugly, violent procedure. It looks like butchery. To the civilian staff watching, I was mutilating a man. To Knox and his team, I was doing the only thing that mattered. I pushed my gloved index finger into the hole, feeling the hot, slick edge of the rib and the squishy resistance of the lung beneath. I swept my finger in a circle, clearing clots. Tanner groaned, a deep, guttural sound of agony that vibrated through the mattress, but the operators held him pinned. "Tube," I snapped, holding out my bloody hand. Dr. Harlan finally moved. He ripped open a 36 French chest tube and slapped it into my palm. He didn't speak. He simply watched, mouth slightly open, as I clamped the end of the thick plastic tube with the forceps and drove it into the pleural space. I aimed posterior and superior, feeding it deep into the chest cavity. Dark, thick blood instantly rushed through the tubing. "Connect him to the Pleurovac," I told Dr. Chen. The resident scrambled to attach the suction unit. The machine gurgled to life, pulling blood and air from Tanner's chest. I stepped back. My hands were coated in blood to the wrists. My knees shook so hard, I had to lock them to stay standing. The roar in my ears was deafening, blocking out the hum of the fluorescent lights, the beeping monitors, and the frantic radio chatter from Knox's shoulder mic. I looked down at Tanner. His chest rose and fell in a steady, even rhythm. The tourniquet on his leg was holding. He was unconscious, deeply under, but he was alive. The spell broke. The bubble popped. Dr. Harlan suddenly snapped back into his role as attending physician. "All right, let's move. We need to transport him to OR1, Page Trauma Surgery. Tell them we have an amputee with a stabilized sucking chest wound. Let's go, let's go." The civilian nurses jolted from their paralysis and surged forward. They took control of the gurney, pushing the operators aside. Knox let them. His men stepped back, forming a loose perimeter around the bed, eyes still scanning the hospital as though expecting an ambush. They rolled Tanner out of the ER, the squeak of the wheels fading down the long, sterile hallway. I did not follow. I stood in the middle of Bay 1, staring at the puddle of blood on the floor. It reflected the harsh overhead lights. My blue scrubs were ruined, stained with a dark, sprawling Rorschach of combat trauma. The ER had gone very quiet. Beverly stood by the charge desk, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked at me with an expression tangled between awe, horror, and profound confusion. I didn't look back. I turned and walked toward the sluice room. I pushed the door open with my elbow and kicked it shut behind me. The room smelled of bleach and old urine. It was perfect. I walked to the deep steel sink, turned the faucet on full blast, and shoved my hands under the scalding water. I grabbed the rough pumice soap and scrubbed. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, until the water running down the drain changed from crimson to pale pink, and finally to clear. But I could not wash the smell away. The copper remained stuck in my sinuses. My left knee gave out. I did not fall, but I slumped heavily against the edge of the sink, gripping the cold steel to keep myself upright. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the sudden violent urge to vomit. Just a float, nurse. The mantra tasted like ash in my mouth. The heavy door creaked open. I did not turn around. I knew the heavy, deliberate tread of those boots. Knox stepped into the small room. He looked enormous in the confined space, his tactical gear scraping against the plastic bins. He smelled of sweat, aviation fuel, and cordite. He smelled like a world I had spent years trying to forget. He said nothing at first. He simply walked to the paper towel dispenser, pulled out a long sheet, and handed it to me. I took it and dried my raw, trembling hands. "Dispatch said the nearest level 1 trauma center was 20 minutes out," Knox said. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of the aggressive edge it had carried in the ER. Tanner didn't have 20 minutes. He had maybe 5. I kept my eyes on the drain. "You bypassed protocol. You violated airspace. You stormed a civilian hospital." "I knew you were here," Knox replied simply. I finally turned to look at him. His face was caked in dirt, his beard matted. His eyes were deeply tired, etched with the kind of exhaustion sleep never touches. "I'm not Whiskey 6 anymore, Knox," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm Morgan. I empty bedpans. I cover lunch breaks. I hide." "You can call yourself whatever you want," Knox said, leaning against the doorframe. "You can wear those ugly blue scrubs and pretend you don't know how to save a life when the world is ending. But muscle memory doesn't lie. When the shit hit the fan, you didn't run. You commanded the room. I hated every second of it, I lied. Knox smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile. No, you didn't. You hated the blood. You hated the reminder, but you didn't hate the work. You're the best trauma medic I ever saw in the sandbox. That doesn't just wash off in a hospital sink. He pushed himself off the doorframe and reached into one of his utility pouches. He pulled out a small, blood-stained fabric patch. It was a subdued American flag with a tiny embroidered skull in the corner. Whiskey 6. He set it on the edge of the sink, right beside the harsh institutional soap. Tanner is going to live, Knox said. Because of you, again. If you want to go back to being a ghost, I won't stop you. We'll get out of your hair. He turned and pushed the door open. Knox, I called. He stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Tell Tanner he owes me a new pair of scrubs, I said. A genuine, tired grin broke through Knox's grim expression. I'll tell him. Good to see you, Dusty. The door swung shut, leaving me alone in the sluice room. I stared at the patch on the sink. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. I didn't touch it. I left it sitting there, a loud, undeniable monument to the things I could not bury. I took a deep breath. The smell of bleach finally overtook the copper. I smoothed the front of my ruined scrubs, ran a hand through my messy hair, and walked back out into the emergency department. The Blackhawks were already gone. The vibration had faded from the concrete, leaving only the steady, abrasive hum of the fluorescent lights. The civilian staff was huddled near the nurses' station. Beverly was on the phone, looking pale and thoroughly defeated. Dr. Chen stood by the trauma bay, staring at the empty bed and the discarded medical wrappers. They all turned to look at me as I walked out. No one spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken questions they were too terrified to ask. I was no longer the float nurse. I was a stranger. I was a weapon they did not know how to categorize. I walked past them, my shoes sticking slightly to the floor. I stopped at the isolation cart outside Bay 3 and picked up the stack of N95 masks I had dropped when the helicopters arrived. Beverly slowly lowered the phone. Morgan, the hospital administration they want to talk to you. I did not look at her. I opened the top drawer of the cart and neatly arranged the masks inside. Tell them I'm on my break, I said, my voice perfectly flat. And when I get back, someone needs to clean up Bay 1. I don't do the heavy lifting. I just float. If Morgan's story of hidden scars and unyielding courage kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that our past does not break us. It builds us. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, raw stories that strip away the ordinary and dive into the extraordinary reality of frontline heroes. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in her shoes? Stay tuned for more.